that is too subtle to be immediately recognizable as not offering any believable facts, and prevarication. To prohibit only bald-faced lies would leave other, more subtle forms of falsity alone, seeming to solve the problem of truth in campaigning without actually doing so, essentially providing a false sense of security. She writes, "The existing campaign deception laws fall short of solving the problem when they target only bald-faced lies about opponents. They cannot promote the integrity of the electoral process if they fail to constrain the other kinds of lies to which candidates can pivot with great effect." These lessons can be applied to current efforts to regulate lies on the internet. In 2018, Senator Claire McCaskill introduced a bill criminalizing false claims of political endorsement, such as claims that the Pope had endorsed Donald Trump as a candidate for president. Setting aside the entirely legitimate concern that such a power might be misused, it would be hard to enforce consistently and even-handedly, even with the best of intentions. The false Pope endorsement was originally published by a National Enquirer-style hoax website. It was not, seemingly, published to intentionally deceive or to boost support for Donald Trump. A sister site ran a similar story about the Pope endorsing Hillary Clinton. Yet, had McCaskill's bill become law, government would be tasked with determining the truth of such stories. It might suppress outright claims of endorsement while allowing the publication of more subtle claims of implied support. What about negative claims of endorsement, such as efforts to link Virginia gubernatorial candidate Glenn Youngkin to Donald Trump? Can government legitimately draw a line here? And would doing so imperfectly provide that false sense of integrity? As Ross writes, even if a regulatory scheme survives strict scrutiny, it could still prove virtually impossible for regulators to agree about where the boundaries between truth and falsehood should be drawn. More recently, Senator Amy Klobuchar proposed a bill to regulate lies about health, or health misinformation, on social media. The bill would empower the Secretary of Health and Human Services to deem certain speech health misinformation and expose social media platforms to liability for lawsuits related to speech so designated. This immediately raises Ministry of Truth concerns. If the Health and Human Services Secretary can designate disfavored speech health misinformation at will, the power to censor health misinformation might be used as a general power to censor. This is at odds with our constitutional tradition. As Ross notes, justices of every political stripe agree. It is perilous to permit the state to be the arbiter of truth. Even if only applied narrowly to health claims, such a power to censor could do tremendous harm. Imagine if, in the early days of COVID, claims of asymptomatic spread had been barred as provocative misinformation. How might this power have been misused during the AIDS epidemic? More broadly, while a right to lie effectively explains why legislative efforts to suppress lies fail to pass constitutional muster, I am concerned that in its laser focus on the many lies of now former President Donald Trump, the book's final section proposes a solution uniquely tailored to a novel problem. Impeachment might have been a solution to Trump's lies, but it cannot be brought to bear on more common and potentially even more dangerous executive branch lies. Ross argues, I think convincingly, that we have good reason to hold the president to the same standards as other public employees. The president's speech is potentially more capable of swaying the public than that of other public employees, and therefore all the more dangerous if false. There are, of course, good reasons one might view this differently. Elected officials and political appointees might be seen as inherently less trustworthy than career civil servants who serve the country across multiple administrations. However, despite the public employee speech doctrine, which gives government the power to regulate speech by civil servants, there are no general statutory prohibitions on lies by public employees. Government employees may be punished for voicing their personal opinions when they conflict with or violates official policy. But this power seems used to restrain truth-telling and whistleblowing as much as it is employed to prevent public employees from misinforming citizens. Ross examines the cases of Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, passed over for promotion for his testimony in the 2020 impeachment hearings, and LA County Deputy District Attorney Ceballos, punished for revealing a flawed basis for a warrant to illustrate how the public speech employee doctrine can restrain truth-telling as much as it can punish lies by civil servants. Indeed, the most dangerous lies told by public officials are not spread by individuals acting on their own initiative, but lies that make their way into policy. Just as top-down misinformation is usually more dangerous than bottom-up lies because they come from more trustworthy or believable sources, whole-of-government lies are more dangerous than those of any one individual, president or not. While the problem of Trump's lies, or the lies of any other president, may be addressed via elections, or, as Ross suggests, impeachment, when lies make their way into policy, they can be more difficult to uproot, and their harms sap trust in government writ large, rather than in any one passing executive office holder. When the pandemic began, the CDC and WHO discouraged mass masking, even contending, despite the experiences of Southeast Asian countries, that there was no evidence masks prevented the transmission of the coronavirus. This claim was sometimes, incredibly, paired with requests to preserve masks for healthcare workers. In February of 2020, Surgeon General Jerome Adams tweeted, "Seriously, people, stop buying masks. They are not effective in preventing the general public from catching coronavirus, but if healthcare providers can't get them to care for sick patients, it puts them and our communities at risk." If masks aren't effective in preventing the transmission of the coronavirus, why would healthcare workers need them? Healthcare workers have special training, not special genes or immune systems. As Zainab Tufekci puts it, how do these masks magically protect the wearers only, and only if they work in a particular field? Dr. Anthony Fauci, director of the National Institute of Infectious Diseases, later explained the messaging thusly. "We were concerned, the public health community, and many people were saying this, were concerned that it was a time when personal protective equipment, including the N95 masks and the surgical masks, were in short supply. This is not a recognition of error about the science of masking. Indeed, early evidence of asymptomatic spread seemed to be ignored out of hand, but about messaging in the face of scarcity. This is a justification for the official lie that masks didn't work. This lie might have been told for the best of reasons, but it was nevertheless told and did great harm. The official lie that masks don't work discouraged early masking, leading to unnecessary loss of life." Ross writes that scientific models projected that tens of thousands of lives could have been saved if at least 95% of Americans had worn masks in public. This early maladvice also, in a sense, poisoned the well, making it more difficult for Americans to trust later official masking advice and the advice of state health authorities more generally. While Ross asks, what if there had been a way to cut the president's lies short months before he left office? This solution fails to grapple with the fact that one of the most dangerous lies of the Trump presidency was spread as much by executive branch agencies and career civil servants as the president himself. We might blame Trump for failing to prevent these official lies. Ross writes, "If the president fails to correct high officers when they tell verifiable falsehoods, or does not correct the public record, the agent's acts and words can also be attributed to the president." Quite worryingly, however, Trump's absence would not have prevented this noble lie. Further complicating matters, fact-checkers at USA Today have rated stories about these false early masking claims at maladvice as missing context, the missing context being that Adams, Fauci, and the CDC later reversed their initial claims about the inefficacy of masking. Other fact-checkers refer to these statements as a mistake. It seems that when enough people buy into a lie, government or otherwise, they can be difficult to ever recognize as such. False official claims about the presence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq or that country's links to al-Qaeda, repeated by the media, are retrospectively cast as mistakes or intelligence failures. This tendency makes it difficult to learn from the most dangerous government lies. They are simply too inconvenient to too many people to ever fully recognize as such. At best, they become sources of partisan division, lies recognized by one party but not the other. This is a far larger issue that Ross hints at but never fully leaps into or attempts to resolve. Are Americans too divided about the basic facts of political life to come to agreement or even engage in productive discourse? Are Democrats and Republicans voting for different policies or for which claim to the truth will receive official legitimation? She writes, "In theory, when the facts that expose the falsehoods are a matter of public record, no ambiguity should remain for a president to hide behind. In a country that appears to be divided over the very nature of established facts, in which many prefer what Trump's senior counselor Kellyanne Conway called, quote, alternative facts, even that elemental level of agreement may prove unattainable." And, going on, in the face of an increasing disconnect between verifiable facts and political discourse, a lack of embarrassment about outright fabrication, and a divide between voters who appear to be operating based on completely different sets of facts, it is reasonable to ask why our society allows such pervasive falsehoods affecting our most critical shared decision-making to flourish without restraint. Paradoxically, this epistemic divide gives us another reason to refrain from regulating lies. In the face of such partisan disagreements about the facts, suppression and censorship simply are not viable solutions. If half the population wholeheartedly believes a lie, suppressing it will only fuel their sense of grievance. Instead, the only way forward seems to be to better cultivate widely trusted sources of knowledge and truth. This is not an easy solution. It is far easier to lose legitimacy and trust than it is to build it. Legacy gatekeepers have struggled to adapt to the internet. Media is often derided as partisan, and often behaves in a partisan manner, and may be unduly deferential to government when independence matters most, particularly on matters of war and foreign policy. Nevertheless, after reading A Right to Lie, I'm even more convinced that the restoration of trustworthy, non-governmental sources of truth remain the only way to promote integrity and trust in American political life. Thank you.
So now we go to the question. And let me start by apologizing to our online audience. We had a period, which is why I left, we had a period where the live stream was down. I'm not sure it's completely understood why that happened, but we very much are sorry for that, and we'll try to get to, and so you didn't hear part of it toward the end there. So very much sorry about that. We'll go into question and answers, and we can have questions here. And if you want to ask a question, please come to the microphone, and yes, don't remove your mask until you get to the microphone and speak directly into it. But let me begin by asking a question that goes back to my semi-joke there about who's to say. There is certainly something in our, and Professor Pfister's comment about the Enlightenment, I think, is very true, because the Enlightenment is based on the notion that human reason could overcome all sorts of problems and could discern truth and make human life better. That was a very pragmatic thing, too. But there's certainly been something in my adult life, in the intellectual life, that does put who's to say, that is a very great deal of skepticism. Or, you know, maybe the most famous philosopher of my lifetime has a book whose title is Knowledge /Power, which is Michel Foucault, right? And Foucault's argument is everything is about power, right? It's an old argument, but he made it cool because he was French. And or something like that. But the old argument is there's no truth. There is just what is told to you by the powerful, and they make up lies to tell you that. So if they're, who's to say, well, they're not, you're supposed to doubt that. And of course, that has now become spread across the political spectrum to where when you talk about, for example, we saw this early, the inauguration crowd, right? So you showed photos or whatever as truth. Then the question became who was showing it to you, right? You really focused in some ways on the idea that the truth we don't experience truth, we are told truth by sources, and do you trust the source? And that was Foucault's point too. You can't trust the source, right? So in the appeals to facts are, plausible, right? It's a fact that if I climb to the top of the Cato Institute building and assert I can fly, I will rapidly find out that I cannot, that it's not a fact, that someone lied to me. But as one of our people online says, what is it, how is it possible to, when you have lots of disagreement, not so much about what's truth, but about who's telling us what's truth, that you can have agreement or prevent lies on to the public on substantial matters? How can this just not become a political question? And then you add that kind of cultural thing about, as I said, who's to say? Now, I don't like to be despairing or difficult, but I'm suggesting there's a cultural problem underneath all of that. And it's I don't like it because it's against what you said. It's post-Enlightenment. It's the Enlightenment is bad or something. Do you have does this bear on you, or am I off of what you've said, or am I off base? Or do you have any answers? If you have some sources on that for truth, I think I'll be happy to hear.
The question of who decides is we as rational citizens, and we should do that by using reason and evidence. Now, it's certainly true in Foucault's case or Nazi Germany. You can convince a whole lot of people of something that is not true. That doesn't make it true. And so just because somebody in power can do that doesn't mean that it's right. And so I go back to John Stuart Mill and the Enlightenment. This doesn't mean that enlightened people, rationality is always going to win. Obviously, it hasn't throughout history. But determining what's true, I think individual citizens have to use reason and evidence, as well as what the source of the information is, and make their own decisions.
Catherine, is it just?
I agree with that, and certainly the Enlightenment was very influential for our founders, and they were aware both of the ancient democracies and the emerging late 18th century thought. And here I might draw a little bit from these legal standards for defamation suits, where the jurors have to decide if a reasonable person would have believed the defamatory falsehood to be true. And there are a number of signals that courts look at that the jurors can take into account, like if it's satirical in tone, if it's hyperbolic, if there are different ways of sort of signaling, I don't really mean this to be considered a fact. And in defamation law, the court puts a lot of responsibility on the shoulders of the person who receives the defamatory statement, and they're supposed to look for those signals. They are supposed to not just talk about their immediate reaction. When I first heard that, I thought it was true, but to, after time for reflection, put it together with the other information at their disposal, and then decide, does it sound like something that's true? And that's what the jury's supposed to figure out. If a lie is simply too incredible, not credible, to be believed, then it can't harm the person who's being lied about, can't harm the person's reputation if no reasonable person would believe it. So if you think about that standard, it expects us to be active listeners and to be constantly testing and comparing, thinking about the sources, and that's very much what citizens are asked to do in assessing reality and truth and falsehood in a public or political context, which is a very Enlightenment ideal.
I guess just building on that comment, what the reader or receiver of information ought to be expected to do. We see a kind of leveling up process there every time we come across a new means of reproducing images or manipulating images. When Photoshop was new, people still treated images as though they would convey facts, that what you saw was real. And over the past 20 years of using the internet, we've become much more skeptical of images. We're likely going to go through this process with video. We're already in the beginning of it. But that sense of society's broadly construed level of trust in various forms of media seems to matter a lot. Avoiding politicizing expertise more broadly, I think, is important, though this is always difficult because the more important to politics some form of expertise becomes, even something that could remain relatively apolitical before, it gets dragged into all of this. And we've certainly seen that around public health over the past 2 years.
So we have a question from Facebook, which I would note in passing, set out a few years ago, maybe 3 years ago, 4 years ago, to not be an arbiter of truth, and then found itself being an arbiter of truth. So this is a tough area. But this question from Facebook was also touched on by several other people online. So how does the argument you make, and I think this is primarily for you, how does it apply to Congress, other politicians, and bureaucrats who are frequently public, or almost always public officials, right?
Yes. Well, it absolutely applies to bureaucrats, civil servants, and so forth. And there, the line of authority over what can be disciplined is much clearer because most people have an immediate boss and even a higher level boss. And the reason this has to go to Congress for the president is the president is sort of the CEO, and who has oversight over the CEO. It's Congress. In a private corporation, it could be, the board of the outside board or the board of directors. But for other politicians, if you are a congressman or a state legislator, the body in which you sit has disciplinary authority over your speech and conduct. For example, if a member of the House of Representatives were to post something threatening the lives of other public officials, it would be incumbent first on their party and then on the body in which they sit to impose discipline. So we normally have a line of reporting that enables us to discipline, and we don't have to reach out to the unusual and unique needs that apply to presidents and very high officials like cabinet members. But in addition to that, I just want to clarify that when public employees are disciplined for what they say, it's not always, and it's certainly, and as I point out, it can be used to go after truth tellers. And it doesn't necessarily mean that those who lie will be punished for that, because it's up to their bosses what they think the speech that should be disciplined consists of. And often it's just something that the higher-ups think makes the office look bad. And that is very similar to a reason that a private employer who isn't bound by the First Amendment, because the First Amendment is only about what the government can and cannot do, cannot punish you for speech or forbid you your speech before it occurs. Private employers can and do fire people all the time for what they say, and they fire people for what they say on Facebook and on Twitter that they just don't want to be associated with. So it doesn't have to violate any particular set of principles or be dishonest in any way. It's something your employer doesn't want you to be associated with. And in fact, a number of the less known figures who I write about, who have turned in, like the woman who turned in Xavier Alvarez to the FBI, she lost her job. And a number of the other people like that in my book lost their jobs for private employers because of what they said.
So I see no one at the microphone here in person. Would you like to ask a question? Yes, please do.
I guess, I guess what I'm really interested in is perception today is truth. We do a lot of headline news, and no one reads the article to find out exactly what that headline news is all about. And we take that headline as truth, and it gets passed over and over and over again. And people are unable to make a qualified decision on things because they don't have the proper information. I grew up in the Nixon era. I watched that unfolding, Johnson in Vietnam, and up until this time now. And I read a lot. I come to the Cato talks, and I'm concerned when I speak to other people that they read the headline back to me, and I consistently say to them, what does that mean? How do you come out with that opinion? And I think that's part of the issue that we're having with the amount of lies that are being told, because you're not going to search them. You're not going to look at them.
If I could just add something from online to this. Given all of that, is there teaching critical thinking and media proficiency, news literary proficiency in the schools, is that something we should be looking at? Is that really the response to that was raised online?
Absolutely, yes. We need to better educate citizens and future citizens, the young people who are citizens but not yet actively engaging in citizenship and voting, how to be skeptical readers. So I think there's a division of responsibility. I agree very much with what Will said about trying to restore trustworthy media. I don't know how you put that back in the barn at this point. It is way beyond my expertise. But the citizenship responsibility means people should not just be relying on pre-selected articles that come into their feed, that they shouldn't be failing to read to the bottom of the story because a headline doesn't always accurately capture the summary of the information. Sometimes headlines are very misleading. And people need to think much more about their sources. So if you read something on Twitter, how reliable is that? For myself, I know there are some people whose tweets I know have proven reliable in the past. I'm more likely to accept what they say, but then I also need to do some other research in more traditional media forms. And I confess, I am a really old-fashioned person, and I read the paper every day in hard copy. The fact that most people don't read a newspaper means that there are many, many stories that they're not exposed to unless somebody already thinks they're following that question. It makes it much harder to read to the bottom of the story. And my father was initially a journalist, and he taught me I had to read the paper from the back to the front so that I would read all the stories, not just the ones that the editors decided were the most important, deserving to be on the front page. That's quite a luxury of time that I know most people can't do. But there is a real, and I think Will was addressing this, that was way beyond the topic of my book. How do we cut through misinformation? And it requires a lot of work on the part of the public and to demand from the legacy news media and what is replacing it that they do a more careful job and make this information available to us.
So we're right at the end now. What I would propose is we have two other people that have stood up. I would like for you to both ask your questions, and then we'll close with your answers. So please, over here on the left and on my left and then to the right.
First of all, thank you very much. I'm really looking forward to reading the book. I tried to whittle this down into like a concrete question, but it seems like even if we're dealing with a fact that's really obviously being violated or being spoken against in a clear way, a fact we all agree on, it's going to be difficult to make progress following your recommendations, which you said yourself. I'm curious what you might have to say about something that's an ambiguous truth or where there is intentional creation of ambiguity. I'm thinking here, for example, we rely on scientists to answer these questions. And this gets to your point about cultivating reliable, credible, trustworthy sources of knowledge. And often we turn to experts and scientists to try to help us understand what an ambiguous truth might be. And so I'd like to hear what you might have to say about the violation of ambiguous truths. I'm thinking in particular about climate science and the debate about climate change. We can think, for example, about is it a lie, for example, when the president seeks to undermine the credibility of scientists? Not saying that the science is outright untrue, but saying we can't trust it. So not necessarily lying about a fact, but trying to undermine those credible sources that traditionally are more reliable. So if you had anything to say about that.
Thank you. Please, our last question.
Sure. I have two brief ones for Professor Ross. So firstly, would incumbent candidates on the campaign trail...
I'm sorry, can you get a little closer to the mic?
Yeah.
Thank you.
You can mask.
We may have a...
Mask.
Oh, okay. Would incumbent candidates face less or have less protections for their political speech than non-incumbent candidates? And secondly, do you think that there are lies that could amount to deprivations or of liberty or process such that they would be actionable under the Due Process Clause?
Under the Due Process Clause. Just say another word about that. I haven't really thought about it in that perspective.
Yeah, so I haven't read the book, but that's what came to mind when I was thinking about executive lies. The first thing I thought of was, sometimes prosecutors or police officers are incentivized to secure more convictions, so they lie, and I'm sure somebody could make an argument that President Trump, in his interest, would behave in a way that also might amount to a property or liberty interest deprivation. I was wondering if you thought that was cognizable.
Very, very interesting twist. Thank you for that. I'm going to take that one first and then go back to the climate deniers. I think you're talking about areas that are already covered by other kinds of laws. It is a professional violation and a legal violation to make misrepresentations in a courtroom. So if a prosecutor or related to a case, if a prosecutor were to do what you're suggesting, many other aspects of law and also the potential to lose one's law license, which we in the profession call a meal ticket, it looms large. We don't need to look to other kinds of solutions. But you're right that if lying were endemic in courtrooms, our whole justice system would collapse. So I don't think due process actually plays into this, but I'm going to think about it more. As to other kinds of science beyond COVID, there are a couple. First, I do think that when a president undermines science generally and says, the voodoo practitioner is just as trustworthy as NHS in a time of a grave health crisis, that is a lie that we can prove scientifically and should be slapped down because it endangers people. Climate science is one of those areas where it might be very, very hard to prove that there's a verifiable false statement of fact. because even though the scientific literature, as I understand it, and it's not my specialty, it's like 99% on the scale, global warming is true, and it's caused by humans. If there's a 1%, there will be people who say, I'm going to go with the 1%, and maybe this is a paradigm shift. You know, people didn't used to believe in gravity. People thought the earth was flat. Or is something an opinion rather than an assertion of purported fact? That's where it gets so hard to actually agree about what a lie is. And also, when we talk about experts, another point that I make is just because someone is an expert in something doesn't make them an expert on everything. And Trump relied on a lot of people who he called experts who were not experts in what he was asking them to speak to. So we should respect experts, but one thing that undermines that is the misuse of experts and false claims of expertise.
So that leads me to, first of all, the other two commenters, do you want anything on this as we run out of time? And I'll finish with my amusing story, my allegedly amusing story, which is when I came to the Cato Institute, came from a university background, and so I was doing TV training right when I first came here. And I didn't understand things very well, so it was explained to me. So I was asked to talk about something that was outside my area of expertise, and I said, well, I really don't know much about that. I shouldn't say anything. I'm not an expert. And to which point the person said to me that was doing the training, if you're on TV, you're an expert. And to me, I think that sums up an entire, probably part of our problems too, because it's not unique to here or anywhere else. So we're going to lunch. It's upstairs. It's on the second level at the George Yeager Conference Center. The restrooms are located on the way up there, but you go up the spiral staircase and then back. Again, the book is A Right to Lie, Presidents, Other Liars, and the First Amendment by our guest today, Catherine Ross. I hope you enjoy it. I thank you for coming and joining us, and please join us also for lunch.